Welcome to Chautauqua People. My name is John V. My guest today is Norm Ornstein, political scientist and commentator, well known to many Chautauquans. He's a native of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a graduate of the University of Minnesota. He took his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. After graduate school, he taught at the School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy, Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He's been associated with the American Enterprise Institute for many years and has been a frequent commentator on network television. Recent books include It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism in 2012, and One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, disillusioned, the desperate, and not yet deported in 2017. Norm, how did you make your way to Chautauqua?
So I've been coming to Chautauqua now for 25 or 30 years. I can't remember the first time I came to speak. It was in the amphitheater. I've come back many times, not every year, but very frequently with family and sometimes by myself. And I've recruited a lot of people to come here as well.
I've heard your talks, and one of them I remember a few years ago. You talked about voting behavior, which I thought is really an area of expertise. And you observed that after much research, the Europeans devised a voting plan better than ours, holding elections on Sundays when most people are off and businesses close down. And instead of the customary American workday, which would have been Tuesday, the old market day. And then they cut back on early voting and absentee voting. What are your current thoughts about how American voting procedures could be improved?
Well, we can start with that, John. And you know, I helped to create an organization called Why Tuesday, which was focused around this idea why we actually vote on Tuesday. And as you said, it goes back to Market Day in 1845. Now, instead of really looking at changing the election to the weekend, which is a tough haul, we're focused on changing it to Veterans Day. It's already an established holiday. We wouldn't be spending money to create a new holiday. And to me, it has just enormous resonance because we have had, for a very, very long period of time throughout American history, Americans in the military who have shed blood and often died to protect that precious right to vote. So you celebrate veterans by having your election on Veterans Day. And it solves a lot of those problems that people have by having an election on a weekday. Now, that's not enough. And obviously, one of the things that we know right now is we're seeing this enormous challenge and set of challenges in state after state to both the right to vote and the legitimacy of the vote. And that's why Congress, Democrats in Congress, are proposing this For the People Act. It's not going to be enacted as it is. It probably shouldn't be enacted as it is. It was written a year ago before January 6th, but many of the things included there to make it easy to vote rather than making it hard to vote are, I think, required right now, and I'm hoping that we can work out something, a compromise that's being led by, as so many other things, Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, that will have some balance, but will also protect the right to vote and also keep partisans from overturning the results of elections they don't like. We need to do a lot to make voting what it should be in this country. It's not just the right of every citizen, even though it's not a constitutional right for everybody, and should be, but having the right to vote is not going to work unless you can actually have the ability to go out and cast your vote.
As a veteran, I like the idea of Veterans Day as a point for that, November 11th. I'm just intrigued. Can you tell me a couple more measures that you think should be included in that?
So, you know, one of our great controversies that we've had for a very long time, of course, is over voter ID. How do you identify yourself when you go to the polls? For many states, it's been, and this is something Joe Manchin has talked about, if you don't have a photo ID, and let's face it, there are significant numbers of Americans who don't. And that includes not just people who are very poor, who don't have a bank account, who don't drive, but it's also a lot of older voters who no longer drive, who have had passports expire. So bringing a utility bill is one of those things. But we know that many states now require a photo ID, and many have made it very hard and expensive to get one. So one idea we've had at Why Tuesday, and this is an idea I worked out with, among others, Martin Luther King III and Andrew Young, is to make available a photo on your Social Security card. Every eligible voter has a Social Security card. You can go in, when I have to get a renewal at Costco, I go into their desk. They have a little digital camera there, and in about 3 minutes, I get a card with a picture laminated, and it costs them about 8 cents. If you can make it available, you just bring in your Social Security card, proof that it's you, and there are many ways in which you have to do that just to get your Social Security card. Not for everybody. We're not making it something very expensive, but easy, accessible, and free. We solve that problem once and for all. And even, this is something that's been supported by Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, and of all people, Lindsey Graham. So maybe we can make that happen. I also very much favor doing something that every other established democracy does, which is to make registering to vote automatic. You have to opt out rather than opting in. Now the burden is on the individual to register. Automatic voter registration, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, all things that I would like to see done. Frankly, if I could go further, I'd love to use our technology in ways that are available, but we've just never applied to voting. So as an example, when I rent a car, as I did coming to Chautauqua, and I'll return it to the Buffalo airport, I'll pull up to budget, and somebody will come out with a little handheld device and scan the license plate, and in 20 seconds, I've got a personalized printout. Right now, we have to vote at a precinct place near our homes. For people who work during the day, you have to go before you go to work or afterwards, the rush hour periods. Now, if we could vote there, or if it's more convenient, down by where we work, or if we could have, as Larimer County, Colorado, for example, does, vote centers. You could go to a Walmart or a grocery chain where there's parking and where they know how to work cash registers with paper tapes, and go in and they could scan who you are and give you a personalized printout with the votes that you're able to cast for your local offices as well as for the federal offices. You could make voting a lot more convenient. We saw many stadiums, for example, do this in the 2020 election. A lot of baseball, football, basketball teams opened up those stadiums. But you can't do that unless you've got the opportunity to have those ballots for the individual precincts. And, if you can do it, if rental car companies can do it, there's no reason why we can't do it more generally.
Indeed. I vote in North Carolina. We go to a local elementary school and gymnasium. Parking and that works out pretty well. Doesn't fit for everybody. And I think these are magnificent ideas. Is vote on a remote box like that. And clearly, if we had shut-ins, we could go have a monitor go day of polling and do those sorts of things.
Let's face it, though, John. There are many ways in which we could reduce those obstacles. But we now have this enormous challenge because of the large numbers of elected officials and other public officials who are trying to make it much harder to vote, not to make it easier. And we can overcome those things with a lot of resources and with a tremendous mobilization. That shouldn't be required. And now we have the added challenge that I mentioned earlier of states that are taking away the authority of election officials, or sometimes, as I saw just recently, a number of reports of states that are trying to intimidate election officials who try to make it easier to vote by suggesting they could be charged criminally. This is I'll use a term that I don't want to use very often. It's anti-American. It goes completely against the American credo and against democracy. So we have an uphill battle to get some of these things done that make it easier to vote. But first we have to get past these obstacles by people who are trying to make it much, much harder.
I know in North Carolina, I've seen shenanigans on both. It's a purple state. I've seen shenanigans on both extremes, and I wish you could come down there and say this is the way it's going to be. Let's switch gears a little bit. Now, you've recently reconstituted a commission on continuity of government. How did that initial commission come about, and what are you working on now with it?
We're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, as we know. In fact, a matter of a couple of weeks right now, 3 weeks. I started this process on 9/11. In a nutshell, I was actually driving to Dulles Airport that morning in Washington. I got to the airport. The first plane had hit the World Trade Center. Everybody was buzzing about it. But at the time, the speculation was that it was a small aircraft that had just gone off course. I went down to my gate. I was on the jetway, ready to board the plane, when they called us back because the second plane had hit the World Trade Center and we knew it was a terrorist attack. I got my car back, went home. My office said, don't come down here, because my office was about 6 blocks from the White House. And I watched, as everybody in America did, this horrible tragedy unfold. But by the middle of the afternoon, I had an epiphany. We knew at that point that United 93 had crashed in the countryside in Pennsylvania because those remarkably brave passengers had thwarted this suicide mission from accomplishing its goal. And what I knew at that time was United 93 had left Newark 45 minutes late, unlike the other planes that hit the World Trade Center and hit the Pentagon. Those passengers were able to get some communication with the ground to know that this was not a standard hijacking where you just sit there calmly because at some point the plane will land and they'll negotiate, but that suicide mission, and they acted. If that had not happened, if that plane had left on time, I believed, and we later got it corroborated, that it was headed for the Capitol Dome. Now, I've been around Congress for 50 years, and 30 at that point. And I knew it was a beautiful day, and that morning there would have been hundreds of members of Congress gathered on the lawn in front of the Capitol, sometimes doing press conferences or with groups of constituents, inside the building doing what we call morning business. And if that fully loaded plane with jet fuel had hit the cast iron Capitol Dome, molten cast iron and concrete, marble, other debris, we could have seen a devastation that would have had 250, 300 members of Congress either dead or missing. What I knew at the time was that it takes, in the Constitution, half the members, in other words, 218, of the House to constitute a quorum to be able to do any official business. And to replace members of the House, special elections take, on average, when it's 1 or 2, 4 months. That would have meant no Congress and the equivalent of martial law at one of the most difficult times in America. And I said to myself, well, there must be a plan, and there was no plan. So I wrote something a few days later in a column that I was doing weekly in Roll Call. I got called by a member of Congress named Brian Baird from Washington State, who had been in the chaos in the Capitol because nobody knew where to go. They didn't know what was happening. And he said I had the same reaction, and we began to work on this. Then a little while later, after I wrote something more about it, Lloyd Cutler, the former White House counsel to 2 presidents, called me and said we need a commission. I recruited Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, who is familiar to Chautauquans, as he's been here many times, one of the great people in public life that I have known. And we created a commission. We ultimately issued 3 reports. I would add just one thing that's relevant now. Of course, we had that terrorist attack, but we also had the Anthrax Scare. And we know that some people died of anthrax. It clearly was not done by some organized terrorist outfit. If they had done it, they could have gotten anthrax into the ventilation system in the Senate, and very possibly we could have had 50 or 60 senators on ventilators or in intensive care units with inhalation anthrax. Now, most states allow senators to be replaced by governors by appointment until the next election, but you can't replace somebody who's not dead. And you can't expel a member, which is what you would be required to do to replace them, unless you have 2/3 of the senators who are there acting. So the problem in the Senate could have been even more significant because of the anthrax scare. We did a report on Congress, and our conclusion was what we needed was a mechanism to have emergency interim appointments to the House and Senate for those who had died until you could hold a legitimate election with time for the parties to choose candidates for voters to have an ability to get to know them. In the Senate and in the House, if they're incapacitated, until those individuals who are incapacitated are ready to come back, and all they had to do was to sign an affidavit that they're ready to come back, so that we could be sure, and this would only be triggered in the event of a catastrophic act, natural or otherwise, sure that we would have a Congress functioning at all times. We didn't get anywhere with that. In the Senate, we actually had remarkable bipartisan support. The subcommittee on the Constitution was chaired actually by John Cornyn, the conservative Republican from Texas. The ranking Democrat was the very liberal Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, and they both co-sponsored a constitutional amendment, which is what it would have taken, but it then never got beyond that point. We did a report on the presidential succession process, which is deeply flawed, which we could get into, but I could just tell you that it was done in 1947 and didn't take into account all the changes that we've seen since then, but it also was very poorly drafted. And the Supreme Court, which has a statutory requirement that you need 6 of the 9 justices to make up a quorum. The Supreme Court is about 150 yards from the Capitol. That morning, the judicial 9/11, the Judicial Conference of the United States was meeting. The leaders of our judiciary were there in the Supreme Court building. They could have been devastated by this, and we would have had appeals courts, but with all these questions that might have arisen, is this a legitimate quorum? Is the Presidential Succession Act, if we needed it, working? Who has the power here? You could have had 14 appeals courts popping up and issuing their own edicts and no body to be able to actually adjudicate it. So sadly, and it's not unusual in American history, once the immediate threat passed, nothing happened despite all of our efforts. So bring it up to date. Now, 20 years later, we've had the pandemic. We know, among other things, that members of Congress in a shutdown might not have been able to get back. And there was no mechanism for them to be able to meet remotely or vote. One of the things that I was able to do, pushing, was to get remote voting in an emergency in the House of Representatives, although the Senate did nothing. We could have a worse situation, which is you could have a super spreader in Congress and 250 members, again, in hospitals, on ventilators, and we need to have provisions in place. Then, of course, we had the events of the election and its aftermath, and then January 6th. And I'll just tell you about the election. So our elections are on Tuesdays, as we were saying. There's no provision if some catastrophic event occurs on the election day to do a redo or to have any kind of way of dealing with a catastrophe. One example I'd like to mention. In 2018, 2 weeks before the midterm elections, there was a Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Michael. A once-in-a-century event, they say. Now they're happening far more frequently. It headed up the Gulf Coast towards Pensacola, a major city. If it had hit, it would have been devastated. Instead, it veered a little bit off to the west, and it hit the panhandle of Florida, but in more, not quite isolated, but less populated areas. And in the couple of weeks, they were able to at least reconstitute and get people back. There was a critical gubernatorial election, the one, by the way, that's elected Ron DeSantis, who we now see acting on COVID in a fashion that is less than ideal, a senator, and if the Panhandle, which is a solidly Republican area, had been devastated, if that had happened a week later and it hit Pensacola, not at all out of the question, you would have had an election swayed by that event, and there's no way to deal with it. What if we had a set of hurricanes or other natural disasters that wiped out the Southeast? An earthquake that hits California. So we have to think through ways in which we can deal with these kinds of disruptions. And we know that the Russians, the Chinese, could knock out the electrical grid in a portion of the country that could be designed in a cyber attack to devastate an election or alter its outcome. And we need to think these through before we have to act after the catastrophes take place. So our commission now is reconstituted. The co-chairs are Donna Shalala, the former Secretary of Housing, of Health and Human Services and former member of Congress, and A.B. Culvahouse, who was a counsel to two presidents, but also served as ambassador to Australia under President Trump. And we've got some of the same members from before and some additions, and we'll be grappling with these and issuing reports probably before the end of the year.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading them. I can't wait. Let's switch gears a little bit here. We're in the midst of another wave of COVID infections. Nearly everyone who has died during the recent wave has not been vaccinated. What have you learned that would help us get these vaccine resistors to change and take the shot?
This is a great human tragedy. And, you know, we have anti-vaxxers, as we call them, across the board. There are some on the left. The fundamental reality that we're dealing with now is that the major challenge is because our politics have become so tribal that even something as powerful as the science has shown and as the results have shown, as the efficacy of a vaccine, not necessarily to keep you from getting the deadly Delta variant of COVID or any other strain, but to keep you from being hospitalized or killed by it. And we're seeing this every single day in powerful ways. But for lots of people, it is, if they're for it, we've got to be against it. And at the same time, we know that there's a broader set of issues here, John, which is that social media and tribal media have spread messages, including patent untruths, that have been amplified by opinion leaders around the country. I saw today that a cardinal who had bought into this conspiracy that the vaccine implanted a microchip in people is now hospitalized in dire condition with COVID. How many people that he talked to, a cardinal, across a wide range of people who believe what these leaders say. How many people decided, well, he must be right, and decided they wouldn't get vaccinated? We're seeing hospitals overrun. It is not easy to convince people who've bought into either the idea that the vaccines aren't proven or that they will lead to infertility. Even being close to somebody who's vaccinated could cause you to lose your potency, or that it could give you a microchip. Once they believe it, you can't use logic, and you can't say you're an idiot. But we have to find ways to convince them. And to me, the great tragedy here is even as the hospitals in Texas and Florida and Mississippi are overrun, and in Mississippi, they have one trauma center at the University of Mississippi. They say they're within a couple of days of the entire hospital system being broken, where they're going to have to turn away ambulances. At least the governor of Mississippi has said, it's your choice, but please get vaccinated. The governors of Florida and Texas are continuing to resist and even resist something else that we know is efficacious, which is wearing masks indoors. In Texas today, Governor Abbott threatened restaurants that if they tried to keep people from going into their restaurants and bars without proof of vaccination, he would move to take away their liquor licenses. This is, I would say, criminal behavior, even if it doesn't meet that statutory test. It's also, if you think about conservatives who believe in free enterprise, the idea that those enterprises are exercising their freedom and you're going to use the power of government to blow them up is, shall we say, a little bit hypocritical.
Indeed, indeed. What leadership examples do we see from the situation 50 years ago with the polio vaccines?
And that's such an interesting parallel, because you and I suspect many of the viewers here, are old enough to remember, as I do vividly, and I know from our conversation you do, waiting in the elementary school line for that, what seemed to be a needle about 12 feet long, to get the polio shot. And we know that when the polio vaccine emerged, and we had seen the devastation, iron lungs, people just, affected horribly by polio. But a vaccine, it's unproven, there was some hesitancy. And then Elvis Presley, who had just joined the Army, on television, got the vaccination shot. And for huge numbers of Americans, it was, hey, if Elvis is doing it, it's got to be okay. We don't have opinion leaders quite like that anymore. But I'll tell you frankly, the great tragedy is that if somebody who is an opinion leader for 40% of Americans, Donald Trump as president, who we know got vaccinated along with his wife Melania in the White House before he left in private, if he had done that on television and said what he easily could have, hey, look how well Operation Warp Speed worked, I'm responsible for that, and now I'm getting this terrific vaccine and you should too, I don't think we'd be in this position. But he didn't. There are certainly some Republicans who are taking leadership on this, as there have been Democrats, but it's already too late for large numbers of people. Once you come to believe that this is not a good thing, it's almost unshakable for too many people. Now, what may make a difference, if we are able to make it happen, as we're seeing in France, where there have been some objections and demonstrations, if you really do say to people, you know what, you can't go in the bar, you can't go in the restaurant, you can't go in the movie theater, you can't go to the concert unless you show proof of vaccination, a whole lot of people are suddenly going to rethink their positions. But at the same time, we have to be sure that we don't get, as we did at this huge super spreader event, Lollapalooza in Chicago, people being told if you pay $50, you get a gate pass for the day and a fake vaccination card.
Awful, awful. One more time I want to switch gears here, and something we've talked about. And some years ago I had the great privilege of meeting your son and talking with him in our dining room. And a tragic loss, and I wonder if Devin can bring this up. And you found a foundation, and I wonder if you could tell us, I'm going to pitch this like so, great picture. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the foundation.
So my son Matthew, I'll try and keep my composure here, who was, as you saw, a brilliant young man. He was a national champion high school debater, went to Princeton and excelled. Was out in Hollywood with success, and at age 24 had a psychotic break. It's around that age that it tends to happen, and had a 10-year struggle with serious mental illness, enormously painful for him and for the rest of us in the family. And he died accidentally of carbon monoxide poisoning at age 34. And we had to decide whether we were going to curl up and just be catatonic, which is your instinct when you lose a child, or to do, as Joe Biden has said, turn grief to purpose. So we created a foundation We've had two major thrusts and themes in the foundation. It's the Matthew Harris Ornstein Memorial Foundation. One is debate, because it was his passion in life. So we've created a summer debate institute for public school kids, mostly Title I schools, the poorer schools in the Washington, D.C. area. We had almost 200 kids this summer, the 7th time we've done it. They learn these life skills. They learn how to argue all sides of issues and do it civilly. They learn how to do research, how to speak in public, and they excel at it. And it's been enormously gratifying. And we focused on trying to make sure that other families and other people like Matthew don't go through the horrors that we've had in a broken system. And so we've devoted ourselves, after learning a lot about mental illness along the way and since, and it's really, I don't even like to use the term mental illness, John, because you could think that it's in your head and you could change. It's a brain disease, and it's like any other organ. But we have a system that doesn't deal with it effectively, that for people like Matthew, who had no insight into his illness and wouldn't take treatment, over 18, had autonomy, and families and loved ones are frozen out and unable to help along those lines. We know that so many people with serious mental illness encounter the criminal justice system, and usually it ends badly in tragedy or in making a bad condition worse. And so we've tried to do what we can to move things along. The main product, something we're going to be discussing here at Chautauqua, came after I encountered this remarkable judge, Steve Leifman from Miami-Dade, Florida, who's completely transformed the way the criminal justice system and the police there deal with those with serious mental illness, found ways to save lives and save money. And we decided, after immersing ourselves in that program, that we would spearhead a documentary called The Definition of Insanity, to dramatize and show what he'd been able to do to spread best practices. And that was on public broadcasting last April, I should say. And we're taking it around the country. We did it virtually. Now we're trying to take it elsewhere to try and make it work better. And I'll tell you, what we're seeing now is reform of the criminal justice system. And here we might get a bipartisan act in Congress that includes Tim Scott, the conservative Republican senator from South Carolina, and Cory Booker, the liberal Democrat from New Jersey, working on prison and criminal justice reform. We see the need for police reform, especially after George Floyd and so many others. And we have a broken system dealing with mental illness. But they all three kind of come together, and if you can work to solve one side of this, you can have an impact on all the others. And we can fix this. We can make it better, at least. We don't know, this is a week for discussion of the brain. The brain remains mysterious. We don't have the keys now to deal with problems not just of the kind that Matthew suffered, but Alzheimer's, dementia, which are so significant now in the society. We're inching towards that, but we can find ways to keep people who are suffering from suffering even more, to make sure that their families don't have to go through hell, and to, it's foolish to talk about things like defunding the police, but reimagining the police force, building on those strengths, understanding, by the way, that more law enforcement people die by suicide every year than die in the line of fire, and that they have their own mental health challenges, as you do if you're in these high-stress positions where you're under threat all the time, as we see with those in the military, PTSD everywhere. If we can find ways to partner with all of these institutions, we can make a better society. And there are lots of ways, proven ways of doing that, as Judge Leifman has found. And so we're really trying to do our part to help make things better.
I'd love to see that documentary. I hope they could bring it to Chautauqua.
It'll be up, I hope, tomorrow on the Chautauqua
Cinema?
I don't know if it'll be in the cinema. In the website where they show the lectures
Okay.
and the like. And
Assembly.
for anybody otherwise who would like to see it, if you go to www.doifilm.com, DOI for Definition of Insanity, it's there available for anybody to watch.
I'm going to see it. Norm, this has been great fun. We are over time. I hope you'll come back again, and we've got some more great material to talk about. Not just another election, but other issues. So thank you so
bet.
much.
Oh, of course, John.